Hey guys, welcome to my presentation about the Escanaba Recreation Area. Here I aim to teach you guys as much as I can about my observations here. I want to make a compiled list of some of the information about plants that I've learned over the years, and I chose to make a guide directly referencing the plants that I've observed growing locally here right at the Escanaba Recreation Area. In this presentation, I'll cover local wild plants. I'd like to talk about all their useful traits. I'd like to talk a little bit about ecology. I'd like to give you some resources on how to identify them in the end. And some of these qualities that I want to talk about include resources, medicinal properties, fire starting, sources of clean water, and just general survival uses. To start, I'd like to mention the general ecology of the area. Just like a lot of the leftover undeveloped sites in Escanaba, this area is considered pretty acidic and generally a pretty poor quality. And this is due to glacial outwash in the past. This is an important factor to consider because it changes the topography, it changes our species composition, and it changes the growth rate. So tree growth rate in these types of soil, it's generally slow, and then species are limited to those that can best tolerate the acidity. And based on the soil type, finding abundant food in the area can be difficult, and you kind of have to pick the correct seasons and conditions to where you can really find reasonable food and other useful materials. So I wanted to make a slide just listing all the plants that I could observe here. This is everything I saw walking around here around mid-November. And since this is such an extensive list, I'm going to try to break it down into some of the more general and useful ones. But just as a side note, pretty much every plant on this list has some form of use. And that's pretty cool to think about. So to start, I'll speak about some of the most useful trees of the area. And this picture is pretty cool. This is a poor conifer swamp at the Escanaba Recreation Area. It's basically a low-lying area. It's dominated by black spruce and white cedar mostly. And a lot of times these are remnants of old cedar swamps that are getting influenced by acidity leaching in, and it's making it more desirable for the black spruce. I'll talk about paper birch. And there's a good reason why this tree was cherished by a lot of Indian tribes. It's because it basically has a use in every area of survival. So to start, in early spring, you can tap it for sap. And you can drink this as a clean, safe water source. And you can even process it down into syrup or sugar. And you can also eat the inner bark, even though it's a little bit harsh. It can serve as an emergency food source. And then as a lot of people know, the bark is one of the best fire starting materials. But on top of that, the wood itself is also one of the best firewoods. This is because it's very low in moisture and it burns very hot. And you can also make a tar out of the bark using the oils by essentially baking it. And it produces a super glue-like substance, which is one of our most ancient uses of attaching arrowheads and spearheads. And then lastly, the wood is also a great building material, and it was the main wood used for canoe building by indigenous people. So American beech is probably one of the best food sources that you're going to find here. And you're going to find them on the top and the middle of slopes. Beech nuts are an edible and very nutritious food source, either raw or roasted. And they'll produce a large mass of nuts every couple of years in the fall. And this is probably one of the greatest food sources for both humans and wild animals. And on top of that, it's pretty easy to identify based on the nuts, bark, buds and the leaves. And they're easy to scout out in the winter because they hold on to their golden brown leaves throughout the season. So now I'll talk about one of my favorite conifers, and this is black spruce. You can actually make a tea from the twigs and needles, which has a very high vitamin C content. This is useful for giving yourself an immune boost when you're sick, and it even has a history of preventing scurvy. On top of this, I think it's probably one of the best tasting and smelling conifer trees that we have. You can splice the roots down and wind them to create ropes or cordage, and you can actually apply the resin of the same tree to both strengthen and waterproof it. So, blueberries, blackberries, and bunchberries are going to be some of the most reliable edible fruits you're going to find here because they all tolerate the acidic soil. You're going to find bunchberries and blueberries inside the forest, especially where there's sunlight actually reaching the forest floor, and they're only really going to produce a lot of fruits if they're inside an opening and they're receiving a bunch of sunlight. And then you're going to find blackberries growing along the edges and trails. And you can even use the leaves of the blackberries as a tea. Now we'll cover a type of moss that you're going to find growing very abundantly across the entire area. Now for mosses, I'll talk about sphagnum moss. This is sort of a complex of mosses you're going to find around the area. You're going to find different species all across the park. You'll find different species in low areas. You'll find some in slopes. You'll find some on ridges. And this is a pretty important moss. It's capable of absorbing fluid. You can actually use it for water storage because of that. And it's also useful for sterilizing wounds and for dressing wounds. This is because mosses produce acid, and this acid will actually disinfect your wound. And it's also soft, so it could be used for bedding, and it could be added to a home for insulation. That wraps up my plant and ecology portion of the presentation. And of course, there's many more species and resources that I didn't cover, including wildfires and fungi. But I think this gives a pretty good starting point. And I'd like to finish by giving a few helpful resources, mainly for plant identification. And the first book I recommend is called Botany in a Day. What this book does is it teaches you how to identify plants by family, which is sort of a top-down approach that gives you a broader understanding of plant relationships and traits. And learning plant families really makes recognizing new species and putting everything together much easier. Second, I'd like to mention Michigan Trees by Stan Tequila. It's a really good beginner-friendly guide to trees, and it was actually one of the first ones that I used. Another great one is Michigan Trees, A Guide to the Trees of the Great Lakes region. This is because it's often considered the gold standard for forests in Michigan because of its accuracy and has some really good field descriptions. And for a more advanced resource that I recommend, it's called the Field Manual of Michigan Flora. This was published by U of M, and it's a pretty comprehensive guide. It's about 1,000 pages of just botanical information and identification. And it's designed for people who already know some botany. But once you reach that point, it's extremely useful and it's pretty much the best of the best. So thank you guys for watching, and I hope this helped you learn something new about the forest.